Good afternoon. It's Friday. You've made it to the end of the week. Congratulations. Hopefully, we're going to just have a helpful session here for about 45 minutes. It depends on how long I kind of get carried away. It's a subject that's very kind of dear to my heart. So hopefully you're all happy to join in. I've got no exercises. We're not going to kind of take you and test you at the end of the session, but hopefully we'll have you involved in some of the conversation. So feel free to open chat, and I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat as we go through the session this afternoon. If you've got any questions, I don't control your mute. I can do, I choose not to, so anybody can kind of join in and ask questions as we go. If you think I'm on a roll and you don't want to necessarily interrupt me as I start talking, feel free just to kind of write those questions in the chat box and we'll kind of deal with those as we go through. So today's session is called, I know it's got a slightly different title to what we kind of build it at, but I've kind of just rejigged that a little bit to talk about kind of embedding the learning for lasting impact. So that's what we're going to talk about today. My name's Eileen Roding. I'm one of the directors at PMO Learning. A real advocate for any type of learning. I've got some background in HR. The favourite part of HR was providing opportunities for people to develop and to be the best they can be. It's something that I've instilled in anybody and everybody I meet. Nobody needs to be absolutely brilliant, but just being the best you can be is to me is what it's all about. So I'm just going to talk you through today about how we can get the most from the training. So when we set up PM Professional Learning, PMO Learning several years ago now, we really wanted to provide opportunities for people who work in a PMO because we didn't feel as though there was enough focus on people in a PMO. So that's where our particular focus is. And as I said, what we're going to try and do is trying to make the most of the training you receive. So a lot of this is really about people who've been on training courses, but it also is applicable if you're a manager and you've instigated training for other people and you're really helping them and supporting them to get the best that they can from their training. And I think the important thing is to kind of go back in terms of kind of what is it we're actually kind of trying to achieve. We're trying, hopefully, to gain some extra knowledge. Now, we can get that through kind of some study or instruction or experience and to develop our competence and, kind of going back to being the best we can be, but obviously to improve our own competence in the organisation so we can do our job better, we can get some recognition and also help the organisation perform better in their various activities. Now, I still do a huge amount of training. It's still one of my favourite things to do, to be in the classroom and to kind of just see light bulbs going on where people go, oh, absolutely, now I understand what that means. Where we talk through examples and go, do you know that happens in my organisation? Yes, I can actually see how I could kind of use this learning in that situation. So that's still what kind of gives me my thrill when I'm kind of delivering the training. But we get to a certain part in the training course, typically towards the end, and we know it's getting tired towards the end of the day. And then this slide comes up, and I know it's there because it's in all of our training courses. And at this point, people say, right, then this is the time to start packing my bag up, kind of very kind of surreptitiously, kind of just closing the workbook and kind of getting ready to leave and starting to kind of think, oh, I'll just kind of start putting my coat on quietly so I can get out the door. And this webinar is really about saying that actually this slide can be the most important one that really helps you embed the learning and really to get the most out of your learning. And I want to kind of pull this apart in a few different ways in terms of things that we've tried to do at PMO Learning to try and kind of help you get into position to use things to best effect, but also to really give you some advice and guidance on what you can do after the training to make sure that you can kind of use it and get the biggest bang for your buck, as American consultants would say. So during the course, we see people get really kind of enthused and have kind of lots of ideas and kind of hopefully kind of the neurons are flashing and kind of think this is kind of really this is really interesting and kind of really important. And then kind of hopefully kind of they don't kind of get too what's the word, brain dead by the end of the course. And we do try very hard in terms of kind of how we deliver that training and how we structure that training to try and make sure that actually it's got a structured design. So we don't kind of throw lots of you at the same time. We kind of chunk that information and kind of breaking that down into kind of smaller areas. So actually it can be ingested, understood, and before we kind of move on to the next exercise or the next kind of concept. We do make sure that anybody who's delivering your training, if anybody who's been on our training courses, hopefully will kind of attest to this, is that the people who are providing that training and are given examples are people who've actually been and done the job. Yes, they have a real understanding of what that actually means in practice. And therefore, what we're trying to do is kind of build up some understanding of some things that you might already know about, some examples that we try and encourage from the delegates to try and kind of build that knowledge over the kind of the days you're there. And we often do that by exercises. Now, having worked for a number of training organizations, the exercises we do tend to be a little bit more than, can you remember what's on page 2? Can you remember what's on page 7? Typically, our exercises will try to expand your thinking, try and help you have some conversations with some other delegates on the course. And all of that hopefully starts to kind of lay down the concepts and the principles in your short-term memory. Now, there is a requirement for you as a delegate to kind of listen. I know we do it, the vast majority of the courses are virtual. I've still got a kind of a real kind of preference for face-to-face learning. But if we're doing even a virtual learning, there is a requirement for the delegates to stay engaged, try not to get caught up in answering a WhatsApp message or an email, to try and engage with the exercises, listen to the trainer, join in the conversation and the chat. So it's a partnership as we go through that training course to make sure that we're presenting things in the right way, providing you the opportunity to really understand, ask questions, practice some of that knowledge, share that with other the delegates, but as I say, from your perspective, to be engaged. When it gets to the end of the course, we put that slide on. And really, a lot of the emphasis then on your ability to use that knowledge and to benefit from that knowledge is really down to some of the actions that you can take going forward. And I just want to talk through some of the things that we would advocate that you could do, and also talk about some of kind of the science and the brain science that sits behind some of those. So these are not just things that we think is a really good idea. These are things that are based in kind of lots of research that have demonstrated how best to remember it. So I'm going to introduce you to some people with big, long names. You don't need to remember the big, long names. Just useful to remember in terms of kind of what they did and what they found. So this is the first person. He's a gentleman called Hermann Ebbinghaus. I suspect he's German. He's no longer alive. He was around in the late 19th century, but did an awful lot of research on how much people actually remember things. And it's quite frightening about how fast we remember things. So I always kind of talk my husband, I'm not sure anything goes in, but he doesn't seem to remember things from 1 minute to the next. But in a training perspective, what often happens is we listen to them, we understand them, but because other things are happening, we've lost almost 50% of that learning within a short number of days. And the longer kind of the period goes on, the more and more we forget. So if we don't do anything at all and just rely on those 3 or 4 days training, the likelihood is within a very short space of time, within a couple of months, we've almost forgotten almost anything and everything that happened on that training course. And I'm sure you've all been on training course where you thought, yeah, I'm sure we did loads of I remember at the time being kind of really interested and being really fired up, but actually I'm really struggling to remember what we actually kind of covered off. And so there are a couple of kind of hints and tips that Ebbinghaus would suggest in order to kind of prevent that being forgotten. And so one of the easiest things to do is actually just to review the materials, just to take the time and effort to, at a future date, kind of go back and read through the workbooks. Now, we've provided everybody with a workbook, so you can, you've not just got the slides and all of the kind of the notes, but you've got the opportunity to review all of the notes that you've taken. And again, one of the reasons why we produce that hard copy and send it to you, because researchers found that actually things you handwrite down yourself actually kind of gets embedded in your memory far more than things where you've just been some typing or you've kind of just watched things on a screen. So actually kind of physically taking notes during the course helps. We, again, try and help that by making sure you've got some kind of evening reading. We would indicate some kind of evening study or kind of some follow-up exercises. But it's not just about doing that once. It's about kind of some spaced repetition. So once you've kind of done a one review, what Ebbinghaus found was actually it stays in your memory a little bit longer, but it still gradually fades. So what you need to do is another review, again, further on down the line. So what has proved most successful is, so if you do the first review within a couple of days, you do the next review in perhaps a week later, and the next review in about 5 to 6 weeks later. So you're gradually increasing your review cycles. And what happens is that your brain starts laying that down, not just in your short-term memory, but in your longer-term memory. And the speed of losing that becomes less and less and less. So when you go on a training course, it's really useful to think, well, how often after the training course should I set aside some time just to go back and kind of review that material? So it isn't just a one-off 2, 3, 5 days on a course. Actually, my training and my learning, my embedding of the learning actually kind of takes place for a number of weeks after that training course. And I think, we often think, well, I've done the course and that's it. But actually, you're reinforcing that learning when you start putting these kind of what's called some kind of spaced repetitions in place as well. And it shouldn't just be just kind of reading through the notes. And again, one of the things, because you've got your hard copy of the materials, what we would suggest, what we recommend, as kind of based on Ebbinghaus's theory and his studies, is that actually writing some additional notes. So you've been on the training course, you took some notes from the tutor and some of your thinkings and some of your discussions. So as you go through the next kind of week and then the next fortnight, the next month, all those kind of spaced repetitions, think about perhaps where you've seen some additional examples, what your thoughts have been. So what you're doing every time you go through that review cycle, you're appending your notes and learning a little bit more and expanding your own thinking. So that's kind of down to kind of just making sure you've kind of got that scheduled in the diary. And it's really I say it's really easy to do, but it's one of those things that I think people don't really understand, the kind of that requirement to kind of keep that learning going for a number of weeks after, to make sure it's really kind of gone in our head. So that's the first thing in terms of just that kind of revisiting the materials, but actively revisiting the materials for a number of times. And I think that kind of the peak is kind of 8 repeat cycles before it actually kind of the rate of recall actually kind of starts to kind of be at quite a high percentage. So it's kind of stuck in there and much more kind of difficult to forget. So the other thing I want to talk about is commitment to action. So again, if we kind of go back to our slide that I put up, and it talks about kind of think about what you can do immediately versus what you might want to do in the future. And we would encourage people to write that down, but not everybody takes us up on that. And again, because they're in the process of tidying up and trying to get out the door, they don't really give this sufficient thought. So what we're trying to do at this point is to get some kind of commitment to action. And ideally, what we want you to do is to actually kind of write down some specific activity. Again, there's room there in your workbooks to say, right then, I've got a situation or I've got a piece of work to do where actually I'm going to kind of do something quite specific that's going to use this knowledge. And the more specific that you can make it, the better it is and the more likely it is that you're actually kind of going to do that. So there are a number of studies. The one I'm going to refer to is Locke and Latham, and they said people who set themselves and wrote those goals down are 42% more likely to undertake them. Yes. So even if just your written down specific goals are to go and do that spaced review over a number of weeks, the very fact that you've written that down, you're much more likely to actually go ahead and do that. The second thing is, it's not just to create a plan and a date in the diary, but actually think about kind of what needs to be in place and start thinking about the kind of the way and the when and the how. So, it might be, well, actually, in a week's time, I'm going to review this material. Well, that gets us part of the way. But the real kind of activity is saying, well, actually, when I come in on Friday morning, I'm going to spend half an hour. I'm going to put that half an hour in my diary. So I know it's scheduled and I'm actually kind of going to do it at that time. And so it's really important that we kind of really link that kind of commitment to those kind of clear goals to actually kind of the when and where and the how, and a diary activity is really helpful with that. And actually having that in an overall kind of, well, I've got 6 or 7 activities or kind of 3 or 4 activities, having that and progressing that is a really kind of helpful. One of the other things is actually to make a personal or public commitment. So we often find that people who do the gym, who go on a diet or are kind of going through kind of a learning, if you go to kind of university, you tend to get kind of study groups, and kind of keeping a group of people where you're making a commitment to do something. Now, depending on your relationship with your line manager and your team, I think that's a really good opportunity for you to kind of come back and say to your line manager and say back to your team, I've been on this training course, I've taken some time out of the workplace, we've invested some time and we've invested some money. So my commitment is over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks is actually to do these activities. And once you've actually made that commitment to other people, again, you're much more likely to actually kind of undertake those activities. So again, if you want to look up some research about that, Cialdini's research actually kind of looked through kind of what that, it's a version of peer pressure in terms of kind of setting those expectations. Now, if you're a manager, I think it's a really good, and it goes back to the investors in people's principles that said, when you're investing in a training course, one of the things that we should have is as your member of staff or your team member comes back into the workplace, say, was the training course what you thought it was? Did you get what you expected to? Right, then let's put in place some specific learning objectives and some performance objectives, tie that into your annual appraisal to make sure that actually we're going to be making some difference to the work as we go through that process. So that is a real kind of written down commitment where somebody else is going to be checking that you've done things. So that's another way in terms of making sure we've got that commitment to action. Now, another way that we might want to think about building and reinforcing that knowledge is saying, well, actually, we've learned something on the course. And what we often talk about is saying, well, there's a couple of things on the course I know I can do immediately. I can use this little bit of theory and there's a specific activity and I'm kind of going to do that. But often on the training course, and again, it's on our slide that says, pick a couple of things you can do now. But what about the longer term? What are the kind of the repercussions and those areas where you listen to a particular concept, you learn a bit of theory, you thought, well, actually, that it's not something I could do now. And I understood what was being said, but actually to really reinforce that learning, to really make it happen, then actually I perhaps want to do a little bit more learning, find a little bit more reading about it, and I actually want to go and try a few things before I kind of really feel comfortable in using it in anger. And so Kolb's, and I can never understand this, KOLB, Kolb's learning cycle, starts saying, well, actually, you've got a bit of knowledge. How do we build up on that knowledge to really kind of make it useful for us and continue to develop and expand our knowledge going forward? So the first thing they would suggest, and again, we try to do this in some of our exercises, is just try a few things. Often, if I'm teaching about project management planning, I'm going to say, kind of don't start practicing your planning on a 3-year project. Yes, start practicing your planning on cooking Sunday lunch. Now you say, but Eileen, I don't need a project plan for Sunday lunch. I've done it so many times. I know exactly what needs to be done at what and when. But actually, it's quite good to kind of distill some of your learning and think, well, what might be the key milestones for cooking Sunday lunch? Yes, and start applying some of the theory to something relatively straightforward, something that you understand. What might be the kind of the key activities? Yes, what are the dependencies between those activities? What are the resources that I'm going to need? How am I going to track that I'm on time to do Sunday lunch? So try and kind of just use some of the theory you've got in some, even kind of not necessarily a work situation, but in a home situation, so you can get to know kind of what they feel like. And kind of as you go through that process, kind of do it properly. Don't kind of do it half-hearted. Do it almost as if somebody's kind of paying you to be that kind of project manager or to be that kind of PMO person and delivering that level of support. And take the time. And again, for those of you who were at the November PMO Learn Day, I talked quite about this, about reflection, about taking the opportunity to sit back and think about, well, how did that go? Did the theory work like I thought it was going to work? Did I think I know something, but actually I obviously didn't know it as well as I thought I knew it, and perhaps I need to go away a little bit reading it. Did anything kind of really surprise me about kind of how well it worked? And what's that taught me about? Well, actually, when I do this, I perhaps need to do something else at the same time, or I cannot do that at the same time. So really give yourself some time to think about, well, how did it work and what did I do well, and how might I do it differently next time? And this phrase, abstract concept, I can't even say it, let alone do it. Abstract conceptualization is really the kind of looking at, well, I'm about to do another iteration. I've done it now based on a kind of a Sunday lunch. I'm now going to think about, I've worked out how I might want to do it in a different position. I've got some different thinking about some of those steps in terms of planning. So I'm now going to use it to do a plan for our week's holiday and the schedule for that week's holiday and all of the activities that I'm going to do. So it's a kind of the next level up set of planning. It perhaps is still a situation and things that you do intuitively, so you don't feel as though you need that theory, but actually it's again practicing it in a more kind of a bigger environment. And gradually, as you kind of keep going around this Kolb circle, you become much more confident in your ability to do things. You've got confidence in your understanding, but all of the time kind of building your kind of real life experience in terms of how that fits. So again, we do this intuitively a lot of the time. I often use the example about crossing the road. Yes, we might not think we use this when crossing the road, but we do. We've all got kind of taught, look right and left. We go across the road when perhaps a young child, and I would hold my hands up now, even when we're an adult, we step out across and as a car comes whistling back and we kind of take a step back and we kind of go, that probably wasn't a good idea. Perhaps I need to look a bit better next time, or kind of take my ear out, or kind of come off the phone next time. And the next time, perhaps we take a little bit more care in crossing the road. But we don't kind of go, oh, I'm about to go through Kolb's learning cycle on how to cross the road and apply the theory that was taught to me by Tufty, for those of you who are old enough to remember. So we kind of do it intuitively, but what we're saying, if we really want to make most of our learning, what we should be doing is this intentionally, as we kind of think about some of the things that we've learned on the course. And again, we're not trying to say do everything that you've learned on the course. Pick certain elements and take it through this cycle and recognize how you're expanding your knowledge and your experience. So the next thing I want to talk about is sharing the love. Yes. So often we go on a course as an individual. Sometimes we go on a course as a team. Sometimes we go as a team member and come back and share those activities. And sometimes we go away as a team leader or as a manager and kind of want to share that. In order for you to kind of be the best you can be, sometimes it needs more than your own personal performance to be the best you can be. It's not just about you as an individual, but it's also the team need to perform well, we need to have the right organization tools and processes to really kind of drive up that kind of capability and the supporting our organizations to deliver projects and programs better. So there is some great benefit from sharing your learning with other people in the team. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that you say, right, then I've been on a 3-day training course. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to try use my one workbook and kind of do a 3-day training course to my team. We would actively discourage that for lots of good reason. But there are potential nuggets or activities or sessions where you're doing your learning and you can kind of share some of the theory and some of the things that you've learned on your course. You can talk them through the Kolb cycle and kind of how you've continued to build your knowledge. And there's some really interesting work done by Etienne Wenger, who talks about actually kind of people who learn together actually kind of continue to kind of really have that kind of shared identity and kind of build their cohesion as a team when they go through that kind of learning together. So there's really kind of good theory to kind of support doing that sharing. But I also think what is really interesting when you try and learn something, and I can attest to this when I kind of first became a trainer, and even though kind of sometimes where I'm doing a course where I've written the textbook, you go on a training course and I'm kind of quite confident about being able to kind of, well, I know all of the theory and I can kind of talk about it. And then somebody asks a question and I'm thinking, do you know, nobody's asked me that question before. Nobody has looked at the theory. Nobody's kind of read the textbook and extracted something and asked a question from that kind of particular angle. And it really was, it's quite sobering because I'm much more conscious now. Whenever I go on a course, there is always the opportunity for a delegate to ask me a question where I haven't got a simple answer to. Because, over the years, and I've been training now for over 20 years, there's lots of questions I've got. Well, actually, I've got 6 or 7 answers because people have asked that question before. I've got some examples on the tip of my tongue and I can go ding, 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 ding. Here's a good answer. But there are still those questions where I go, well, I'm going to have to think about that for a bit. I'm really going to have to think about how I would apply that theory in a situation that I've never been in before, but obviously one of the delegates is now, to think about how I apply that. And often when I'm doing development paths and kind of career paths for senior people, I get this, well, I've been on all of the courses, there's nothing else for me to learn. And I say to them, the best way to learn is to try and teach somebody else what you think you already know. Because all of a sudden you then find, well, actually, perhaps I don't know it quite as well or quite as in depth as I thought I did, but it will continue to challenge you and expand your knowledge. So this kind of sharing the love is great for the team, but actually it really goes on as well to kind of build on your knowledge and develop your knowledge and your understanding of the theory. And I can honestly say after 20 years of training, that still happens to me on a regular basis. I don't think I've ever been on a training course where I've come back and think, well, actually, I've picked nothing up from that training course. Even as the trainer, there's nothing I've picked up from that training course because there's always a delegate who's been in a new situation, who's got a kind of a new question that they want to ask me. So this kind of sharing the love, sharing the knowledge is a really good thing for both you and your team. And then the kind of the final bit of theory that I just want to talk about in terms of how to get the most of your knowledge is about actually measuring success, about how do you recognize that actually you've learned something that actually has kind of made a difference. And often from an individual's perspective or a manager's perspective, you want to know that the money's been invested, that you've actually learned that it hasn't been a waste of time. If you're an individual, what you want to demonstrate is actually I've been on a course, I've learned something, perhaps I'm now ready for a promotion, and recognition at the next level, or actually I've kind of built up my knowledge, I've demonstrated I've learned it, and I've demonstrated that actually it's worth investing in my training, and therefore when my next come along and kind of want to do some more development or kind of go on another course, I'm going to make it worth your while sending me. And so there is a framework we often kind of talk about called the Kirkpatrick model that says there's essentially kind of 4 levels where we can measure our success in terms of kind of getting something from being on a training course. And the first one, and as a training provider, and hopefully, kind of all of the training providers do this, our first level is actually kind of just what was your reaction to the course? Did you enjoy the course? Sometimes it's much easier to kind of understand and stay engaged where you're actually kind of enjoying yourselves and there's some kind of conversation that helps you interact as you go through the course. So anybody who comes on one of our courses gets a feedback sheet and says, how did you find the course? Is it what you thought? Was there any problems? And we all know that it doesn't take very many kind of spelling mistakes or issues for it to detract from the learning. We really want to focus on that learning. So we're very keen to understand kind of how that reaction has been to that course. The second level is, did you actually learn anything? What have you picked up as you've gone through the course? When I first did some project management and I was running a couple of projects, so I'd actually run some projects before I'd been on a project management training course. And when I went on the project management training course, and I eventually became very, very good friends with the trainer. And we talked about what I'd learned on the course. And in terms of kind of project management theory, I argued I didn't learn anything at all because actually, planning, yes, that's the official name for what I already do. Risk management, that's the official name for what I already do. But on reflection later on, and I did go after I'd kind of said you taught me nothing, what I said was actually what you did do was take a lot of what I learned and actually put some structure around it. It was much easier to say, well, actually, now I understand how this bit fits with this bit. And actually, there's a link over here. So even though I might not necessarily have learned any new theory or new concepts, just that kind of formalization, that structure and kind of the connections was something I kind of took away from that training course. But every course, there should be some things that are new that you take away. As I say, even if it is just to kind of reinforce what you learn and kind of learning some kind of, sometimes it's learning that people have different perspectives and their understanding of a subject is very different to yours and it's applied it in some different way. So it might not be the theory, it might be the application of that theory that you learned. And one of the things, again, as a training provider, what we ask at the end of the course is, have you achieved your learning objectives? Have you learned what you wanted to learn as we went through that course? So again, we kind of work with you, and hopefully our trainers will make sure and kind of keep a check on that as we go through, which is one of the reasons why we ask what your learning objectives are when we start. They'll do that check at the end, and even though they don't say it kind of 4 o'clock on a Friday, right, then we've not achieved our learning objectives, so we're just going to do another couple of hours on a 4 o'clock on a Friday night. That's not where we would be, but hopefully they will kind of follow up with some kind of additional material or some links to kind of support you through getting to those learning objectives. But that really only kind of gets it into your head. And so from an investment perspective and measuring the success is really if you go back into the workplace and do something different. Yes. So what are you going to do different, or what have you done different because you've been on the training course? Now, it may not be, you might not kind of radically change your role and how you undertake that role, but actually you might be able to do it more effectively because you've got a better understanding of the process that you're following and why you're following that process. It might be much easier to collaborate with other members of the team or other functional areas across your organization. It may be much easier to actually recognize where other people are being kind of stressed or why they've got a particular level of urgency around some of those tasks. So it's really about how have you taken your learning and applied it in the workplace? And again, if you've had the conversation with your manager or your manager and you've had a conversation with your staff at the end of the training course and said, well, actually, this is what I'm going to do differently, you've automatically kind of put yourself into that kind of review kind of 3-6 months later on. But if you've not had that kind of conversation with your manager, it's a really good thing to kind of bring up either in your one-to-ones or in your end of year appraisal or 6-monthly appraisal to say, we went on that training course and I'd just like to tell you what I've done differently since I went on that training course because it was really useful, it was really helpful, and this is how it improved my ability to do my role. So that's really the third stage. And I would argue there's an awful lot of organisations don't take the opportunity to do that. As a training company, it's very hard for us to do that. If we've got kind of a long-term relationship with an organisation, we can kind of help the organisations do this. But that's really down to kind of you, your line manager, and your team to kind of really go back and decide on whether the learning has really been worth what you've paid for it. And then finally, is actually what is the impact on the organisation? And again, this is where it kind of reinforces that fact that kind of sharing that learn and sharing the love, as I would say, with the rest of the team says, actually, what that's done is enhance the reputation of our PMO, because actually now we've got a much better understanding of kind of why we're delivering some of the services or how to deliver those services. Actually, what that's meant is we're more effective. It means that actually now we've got a bit more knowledge in the team. We can kind of rotate people around who are learning new opportunities. So there's actually not just a difference to me in how I perform, but actually there's a difference between how we perform as a team and our value back to the organisation. And that's really, kind of what the investment in training is all about. If you kind of speak to anybody who is kind of in an L&D role, the whole reason why we invest in training is so the organisation can have better results. And that has to come through individuals doing things differently in order to achieve those results. So if you can kind of articulate that based on an, so these are the things that I consciously did after the training course to make that happen, you're actually kind of demonstrating you're understanding the learning process and you're making the most of it, and you're worthwhile investing in again for some further development. So those are just some kind of theoretical things that hopefully help you if you've been on a training course or about to go on a training course. Will give you some of the ideas in terms of how you can kind of make the best use of that. There may still be situations where you've been through the training course, you've understood it, but you're really struggling to embed that learning in your organization. And so what PMO Learning do, we do it through our trainers, so people who've necessarily been there through the training courses. We either offer one-to-one coaching. So again, we do this quite frequently. Somebody will go on a training course and say, well, actually, to help me really understand it, to walk through that cold learning cycle, to be that learning partner. So I'm actually kind of committing to doing some activities. I'd like a personal coach to run some sessions with me. Now that might look like an hour a week, an hour a fortnight. There are some where we've got kind of long-term coaching agreements where essentially we do a couple of hours once a month. I was in London yesterday, met with somebody who I've been coaching for the last 2 years. So it's not every week. It's just every now and again we have a kind of catch up. We do a little bit of a challenge. What have we learned? How it applied? What's your plans for the next kind of 3 to 6 months? So that kind of one-to-one coaching. What we also do is kind of group coaching, and this takes the where somebody might have been on the course, they've gone back into the organisation, they've tried and kind of sharing some of the love and said, well, actually, we don't necessarily need everybody to go through the full training course, so that is, of course, an option. But actually what we're looking for is some help in terms of how to embed that learning in the team. How can we change our team processes and the things that we do on a day-to-day basis? And actually we want somebody to help and kind of coach the team. And again, we've got a piece of work that we're doing with a client at the moment. Somebody on the team came on our assurance training course, and we thought, actually, this is really good and useful. What we want to do, not do the whole training course, pick a couple of those elements. And we did a one-day session where we had 45 people from that organisation came in and just kind of, we picked up the key aspects for that organisation. And then what we're doing now, we're coaching a small team who are writing the assurance framework for their organisation. And what we're trying to do is kind of teach people to fish rather than giving them a fish. So we're helping them embed the skills and capabilities. So we could quite happily, they could have come and said to us, can you write our assurance framework for us? And Roy, who's our assurance specialist, would have said, absolutely, yes, I can. Here's a kind of X number of days consultancy, and here's your assurance framework. What we find to be much better for the individuals in the long term is if we say, well, essentially, let's talk through a couple more elements in a little bit more detail. let's think about what the context is for your organisation, workshop a couple of those elements. And I say workshop, we're not talking days at a time. For this particular client, we've got 4 1.5-hour sessions. And in each of those 1.5-hour sessions, we'll have a couple of exercises. We'll use the Miro board. We'll kind of think of some of those, explore some of their challenges. And then essentially they get homework. So between that session and the next coaching session, they've got some of that kind of document to kind of review, update, and write. And then as we come back into the next coaching session, we'll do the same type of thing for the next section or the next iteration of their assurance framework. So again, this is not just about kind of an individual, but it's helping a team actually kind of build on that learning. And it means that they're much more confident that by the time we finish those 4 sessions, hopefully they're in a better place that when the assurance framework needs to be updated in kind of 6-12 months time, they'll have been through that learning process. Again, going back to kind of Enger's community learning, because they've learned together, they know they've had some of the conversations, they know they can kind of go back to that team and say, remember those conversations we had with PMO learning when we did this particular section? Remember we talked about this? I just want to kind of explore that in a little bit more detail. Really kind of sets them up for their success going forward. So we don't want to be in a position where every time you need kind of to do the same thing, you come back to us and pay on a kind of a consultancy basis. The whole idea is that, we call ourselves kind of PMO learning because we want you to learn and develop and to support you and essentially make you independent around all of those different areas. Now, I have to say very quickly, that doesn't mean you're never going to come back for some any more training, but it means that actually, you're not going to be paying for those kind of same thing, because what you're doing is continuing to build and grow your own personal capability and competence. So that's me. Just hopefully there's some kind of interesting elements in there. As I said, this is not kind of Eileen's view on how best to make the most of your learning. There are some kind of really kind of structured reports and findings and papers that kind of demonstrate this is the best way to make the most of your learning. So hopefully it's been helpful. Has anybody got any questions? So you unmute and ask the question, or kind of stick it in chat. Feel free. Oh, you're all very shy.
So, okay, Eileen, here's a question, or maybe some advice you can give. If I'm training project managers on any subject, right, how to do risk management or whatever it might be, and let's say there's I don't know 100 pieces of knowledge that they take, for example, and they say, well, I can use some of that in my day-to-day job, and I'm using all the stuff that I need, and therefore the stuff that I'm not using must be stuff that I don't need. How can we encourage them to still try and take action, as you suggested in this call, to encourage them to still keep as much of that knowledge as possible, even if they're only realistically using 20% of that in their day-to-day job? How do we sell the benefit of keep learning all this stuff, keep reviewing it, keep looking at it again, keep having those mentoring sessions and coaching sessions, if they're only using 20%? But a lot of the pushback is, well, I don't need the other 80%, so that's a waste of my time.
I think that there's a couple of things, Aaron, that I would suggest with that is, as you're going through the learning process and that kind of training process, if the course is structured well, we'll be able to see how the knowledge continues to build on areas we've already covered off. So we're continuing to say, well, actually, when you know this, well, actually, you can expand a bit, and then you can do this a little bit better. And actually, if you build it up, then you can do a little bit better and a little bit better. So hopefully they can kind of see the connection between one piece of knowledge and another piece of knowledge. Now, so they can say, well, actually, that first 20% absolutely makes sense with the job that I'm doing on my day-to-day basis. It may also be, well, actually, that's the 20% that's kind of most useful because of the organization and the role I'm in. So what we talk about in that slide is actually what can you do immediately? And that's the kind of the 20%. And a good manager, a good team leader will start saying, well, what else did you learn? So how are you going to grow as an individual, how is your role going to develop? How's the maturity of the organization going to develop over the next 3 to 6 months? And let's start thinking about, well, actually building up the useful bits from 20% to 40%. So when we're doing that review, we're starting to say we'll reinforce that kind of 20%, but actually not only are we kind of doing those kind of spaced learning, but we're actually kind of going in a little bit deeper and starting picking up those extra bits. So that kind of cold learning cycle, you're starting to do it with new bits and that additional bit of the knowledge as you become more comfortable in the bits that you already know. So you look at it as a case of this training course is not just to help you with your job now, but it's to help you in 3 6 months time as you grow. And I think I'd be fooling nobody if I said on every course that you go on, you're going to learn, you're going to use every single bit. Yes, because that doesn't happen. But I think when you come off the courses as I said, our kind of slide says that what you're going to use immediately and what are those things that I can see myself progressing with a bit more knowledge and a bit of play, I can actually recognize I can use later on. So that kind of structure hopefully will encourage them to do more than just the 20%.
Right, thanks. I guess that kind of leads to there being a good partnership or relationship between the trainer and the managers of the trainees, because we're relying then on the managers to continue that cycle, because the trainer they may be on to the next course and the next class coming through.
Yes, and to be fair, and I don't know what happened to investors and people. So when I was an HR manager, before anybody went on a training course, and we tried to kind of do it as a training company, is what is it you're trying to achieve? And we were having this kind of conversation recently. There's a difference between your learning objective, so what do I want to learn on the course, and learning outcomes with what do I want to be able to do differently after I've learned what I've learned on the course. And to a large extent, responsibility of moving from learning objectives to learning outcomes sits with the individuals and the line manager who've invested in the training. So as a training company, we can kind of help solve some of those conversations. So as I said, we would always ask, kind of what are your learning objectives? What do you want to learn on the course? And as we go through the exercises, we talk about, kind of how they can apply that in the workplace. Because I think when delegates come on the course, they're much more kind of, what do I want to learn? And then as through kind of the conversation, the exercises, we explore how much they can kind of develop their outcomes. But that should be the conversation that is had with the line manager on return to work, because they say, what have you learned? Did you learn what you thought you were going to learn? And sometimes, you go on a course and say, well, it wasn't what I expected it to be. I thought I was going to learn this, but actually I've learned something different. Now, do tell us if that's one of ours, because hopefully we're clear in our kind of course outline, you know what you're going to get. But then the manager says, right, then, so what is it? How do we get you to kind of change new behavior? What are those kind of learning outcomes? And again, that's the conversation with kind of, is there any other ways we can support additional learning? And, that's why we do some of these kind of lunch and learns to talk about some of those kind of wider contexts that we perhaps don't have time to do on the training course.
Cool. Thank you.
Annette, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, mine was around the more tailored maybe training or consultancy that you can do, Eileen, and whether that is for individuals as well. So if someone like myself was perhaps looking for individual training or support in developing my career, is that something that you can help with as well?
So I think there's a couple of things, Annette, that we've done with some delegates or kind of potential delegates. Is somebody we've got one at the moment, is somebody who wants to go on a course, but rather than go on a course because they can't commit to 3 days, what they want to do is that it through coaching. So essentially, we would use the materials to say, well, actually, do this kind of bit of reading. We'll do a coaching session. Through that coaching session, we'll cover off the theory on the course, but it's wrapped into, and there's a much more detailed conversation in terms of what are you going to do with it before we coach again. So we're almost kind of thrown into that training, and it's more difficult to do on when you've got kind of 12 delegates on a course, to have that individual conversation every time you kind of cover off some aspect. But actually, and I did it for the essentials for managers courses. So we met up and did some half-day sessions and says, you know, kind of this is the theory. We talk about the context the lady was in their particular organization, perhaps how the theory might work. So the coaching and the learning went hand in hand, a chunk at a time. So that's where it's kind of around one specific course. The people who we use our coaching have access to the materials, and many of them are members of the House of PMO, so they'll have access to House of PMO materials as well. For those of you who don't know, that's a professional body for people who work in and around PMOs. And what they'll do is they'll talk through with individuals, what are your challenges, what do you want coaching on? And what they'll do is they'll bring aspects from lots of different courses and lots of different kind of papers, articles, and kind of webinars to say, well, actually, there's 3 or 4 things you might want to look at, but actually this is some theory and some concepts that might be useful for your particular subject. So, so it goes back to, you know, kind of the trainers that we've got are all capable of doing coaching, and because they've done the job, they recognise that all of the knowledge and support you need isn't just held in one particular training course. And I'm sure some of you who've been on our training course is that the trainer said, oh, yes, I've got a link, I'll send you the link to that, or they'll put something in chat that kind of expands your understanding. So essentially that's what we do on a one-to-one basis. So rather than just focus on one course, we can kind of pick that up from across the piece. And to be fair, we've done that with a group of people. They've said, well, we don't just want one course, we probably want bits of 3 courses. And that's where we do a tailored course for the organisation, where we pick off kind of 3 or 4 key learning areas, and we'll pick bits of material, and we'll produce a course workbook specifically for they're part of the organisation.
That's lovely. Thank you, Eileen. That's really helpful.
Thanks a lot. Any more questions? Well, it's been lovely. I hope you've picked up something. Some of those kind of areas of theory you might have learned before. Hopefully, you will kind of be able to kind of take some of those. And even if your learning was kind of not particularly recent, you can kind of start that kind of refreshing cycle and start going to have a look at some of the aspects that you learned on the course, and start putting that Kolb cycle into good use. So these are our up and coming training courses. Jen's just put into the chat a link to our kind of full schedule. And if there is anything else at all you want to speak to me about, or kind of speak to the team about, feel free to get in touch. We'd love to speak to you, and we love what we do, so we're more than happy to have a conversation. Thank you very much. Take care.